China moves against Taiwan, that's catastrophic, obviously, mostly for Taiwan, but also the rest of the world. So similarly, if there's a massive trade war, that can end up being very bad for the rest of the world as well.
Welcome to Brave. Learn from Southeast Asia's best tech leaders. Build the future, learn from our past, and stay human in between. No BS on success. I'm Jeremy Au, venture capitalist, serial founder, Harvard MBA, science fiction nerd, and dad of 2 daughters. Every week, we debate startup news, interview changemakers, answer listener questions, and share personal insights. Join our movement of over 40,000 members and get transcripts, resources, and community at www.bravesea.com. Stay well and stay brave.
Hey, good to see you, and now we're back in person.
Yeah, it's good to be here.
Oh, what an upgrade, I guess, from the way we did it in the past. It was, I think, a great explanation about your story and how you see Southeast Asia and your ideas for business in Southeast Asia. And now I'm just happy to have you back in person.
Yeah, no, it's fun. I haven't been to Singapore in a couple of months, so I thought it's good to swing by.
Yeah, amazing. And I think that one listener was saying, so does he think about the US Southeast Asia interactions? And I was like, that is an excellent question to go into, because I don't know either, actually, really. So I just thought it would be a nice way for us to just brainstorm and talk about what's going on.
Yeah, sure. I would say that anyone who claims to really know what's going on is being a bit overconfident, I would say.
So this is going to be a speculation episode. Rather, don't look at this as definitive. This is not investment advice.
But by the time, like I was saying earlier before we turned on the cameras, that I wasn't sure if there had been something announced in the last day or two since I've checked the news that would invalidate what I would say here. And there's going to be another week or so as you edit this where more could have happened to completely show people that it's completely off base here.
This episode only works for 24 hours, otherwise it's too stale like a croissant. You know? But I think the way that we get it, obviously, is it feels like the USA after the elections has gone through this massive change, obviously, under the Trump administration, with a mandate to change and with a desire to change, and the velocity has been very huge. And so I think everyone's still processing. So maybe why don't we zoom in maybe on America first and say, how would you summarize the situation from your perspective?
I say Trump came to power with the mandate to rebuild America's manufacturing base. And one of the main tools he sees to use this is tariffs. And that, in their minds, they see it as a consumption tax they can use to try to force Americans to both invest more locally as well as potentially consume a bit less and switch back to a higher saving society.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting because that was something that was actually new to me even the past week, which is not looking at tariffs as a way to control trade, but also as a way to be a consumption tax, similar to the goods and services tax, GST in Singapore, value-added tax in the EU. So it's been interesting to hear about it framed that way.
Yeah, this is why he's opposing the EU, because he sees that as something that prevents their citizens from consuming while not imposing that on the rest of the world, which they're exporting to more cheaply than their consumers are able to buy those products.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, right? Because traditionally, value-added tax is meant to say, hey, we're going to capture all the economic activity, is relatively fair, efficient, and it lowers consumption to some extent and raises tax revenue. So I think people have always looked at it as a domestic issue rather than now value-added tax is being seen as something that Trump wants to rebalance against.
And in general, from the economic point of view, I'm not sure that the consumption tax matters as much as, let's say, the trade barriers that China is putting up, that just making, or even the EU's putting up and fining all the US tech companies billions of dollars. I think that's a much more direct anti-competitive aspect that hopefully the Trump administration will figure out how to push back against compared to the value-added tax. But the value-added tax is something else. By putting it on the table, maybe they can get concessions for not taking it when they take it off the table.
Tricky part, because I think the tariffs have a scenario where asymmetrical, right? So only America imposes tariffs, and then there's also the reciprocal effect, which is supposedly that's where a trade war happens, right? And I think that's like the tricky part that everyone's like not sure about. Is it like, is Trump going to be able to do it where it's primarily one way and he gets what he wants, which is again sheltering US manufacturers and moving production locally, versus does it become more symmetrical where the trade war happens and then American exporters also lose in that scenario?
If you talk to economists, obviously all economists agree that tariffs are generally not great for world trade. And there are potential like corner case exceptions to this. But for the politicians overseas who are listening to economists, the proper response to a trade war escalation is actually to not escalate. Because if you add tariffs on top of the other person's tariffs, you're just hurting your own people in the same way.
Yeah.
So The problem with this is that around the world, especially at least in the Western world, it seems that one of the things that politicians have figured out is that the best way for them to win re-election is to run against Trump in their country. And they're anchoring this on Canada, where the Liberal Party, Trudeau's party, now Trudeau's out. They are actually in a much better chance to win the election since the tariffs and since they started running against Trump and not the opposition. And I think a lot of European leaders and other people around the world think, hey, if we can run against Trump and not our opposition, we can actually win that election.
Like you said, the two alternatives are Mexico is very much been more on the passive, let's keep it low key, whereas Canada has been very much more, we're willing to escalate or go tit for tat.
Yeah, but in both cases, Mexico is actually actively pushing back as well. And I think their president's never been more popular at this point when they're seen as the person standing up to their neighbor up north.
Yeah.
So it's an unfortunate dynamic that encourages more conflict and leads to a lower chance of positive resolutions because the leaders are incentivized to make the problem worse and to try to rally their population around them against a foreign adversary.
Yeah. So let's talk about those two scenarios, right? One is the positive resolution that you mentioned. That will be a negative version of this future. Let's say we fast forward, I guess, 3.5 years in the future. What will be a positive scenario and what will be a negative scenario?
From the perspective of the US, one of the positive scenarios is that instead of actually trying to only use tariffs to fix this problem, tariffs are one part of the solution, and they implement other aspects to make it easier to build in the US. You always look at these numbers where it costs more for the US to build roads, it takes almost twice as long for them to build new semiconductor plants compared to other places around the world, and there's all this red tape and regulation that needs to be cut through in order to allow people to build as quickly and as efficiently inside the US, outside the US. So if the Trump administration only does tariffs, that's not going to be enough to increase the production inside the US. It's not just cutting the red tape where the red tape is completely useless. There's even scenarios where, yes, we want these environmental regulations. We don't want you dumping toxic chemicals into the river, but we're going to have you prove that you're doing this in a far more cheap and efficient way than you had to prove in the past. So you pay less lawyers, less consultants, and the project gets going much faster, which lowers the cost of capital of the project in total. Yeah. And there's ways where hopefully that can result in a lot more manufacturing being done inside the US. And that's the positive scenario where the US industrial base is revitalized from a collection of these policies in total. Yeah. And maybe the rest of the Western world as well also realizes that they need to pivot away from the dependency on China and that they also are able to do something similar in their economies.
And what would the negative scenario be? Would it be like asymmetrical trade war, everybody has reciprocal tariffs, the efficiency doesn't play out?
Yeah, the negative version of this is higher tariff barriers that just make everything more fragile, some companies going under that wouldn't have otherwise gone under, combined with no real reforms that actually revitalize the industrial nature of these various economies, as well as then maybe the thing that everyone is worried about with China making some move on Taiwan that cuts them off from China, and people see just how exposed they really were to having outsourced key parts of their industrial base to China.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of fear actually, and some of the Chinese nationals I've met feel like there's like a 20-30% chance of some Taiwan issue going sideways in the next 5 years, which is, I think, pretty high percentage.
Yep, and it's definitely a worry, and there's all different parts of the economy where there's some key component is being made in China at this point, and they might have even lost the ability to manufacture it in the US at anything like a comparable price. So if China truly gets cut off from the world because they make a very strong move against Taiwan, then we'll see a lot of different industries realize just how dependent they are on that manufacturing base, and how long it takes to scale up the replacement parts will be another big question. We saw that the last time we needed to scale up production of various things during COVID with the masks and whatnot, we didn't do a very good job of replacing some of those capabilities.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be a tricky part because I think China is also doing a similar move, right? Where they're trying to become more self-sufficient as well. Ever since Xi Jinping came to power, he's been very much like moving and diversifying, for example, their commodity space, moving away from American soybeans to soybeans from South America and other parts of the world. So it's been interesting to see them also becoming more self-sufficient in that way as well.
And that's some level of self-sufficiency, but having produce made in South America and Africa, there is still the issue where a blockade would actually prevent those from getting to them. So they're still not quite self-sufficient in a way that would allow them to become a total pariah of the world.
Yeah, and I think there's a little bit of like talking past each other in this one, right? Because there's this dynamic where China is working very hard on South China Sea to avoid potential of a blockade right? Because they were as existential for them. And vice versa, there's also this whole dynamic where, people don't want them to be operating in the South China Sea. So I think there's
But they don't want them to take over and claim the South China Sea when it was never part of their country to begin with.
So I think that's the tricky part where everybody's like maneuvering, and it does feel like flashpoints in the next 5 years.
And there's flashpoints with all the different countries in the South China Sea because China's claiming territory that otherwise around the world is recognized to belong to other countries.
Yeah, the exclusive economic zones and so forth. So not an easy dynamic. And I think for me, I always think to myself, like, since there's a 20-30% chance of Taiwan going sideways, moving beyond that, there's a certain level of economic first order, second order, third order effects going to happen, right? First order effect would be, it's hard to replace what TSMC has available on Taiwan in terms of production for semiconductors. But I'm curious what you think those second, third order effects are going to be.
There's all sorts of electrical parts and things like that that are also made in China, all sorts of basic machining parts that are mostly made in China. And to get them at scale, people are still getting them from China. And so there's a lot of these other businesses that would not necessarily be able to operate if China moved against Taiwan and people had not moved enough supply chains out of China. I think that's the race right now. And that's what Southeast Asia is benefiting from, is this push to move various supply chains out of China. Obviously, the Trump administration and others might prefer that some of those go back to the US, but in the short term, there isn't that capability to produce certain things in the US at a price point that would make sense for the world market, but there is that ability to do so in Southeast Asia and in India. And so there's been a lot of production moving to those places to hedge against this big risk that people saw play out in Russia.
No, I think there's a fair point. Actually, I never thought about that, which is that if there is a Taiwan conflict, that issue is, it's not just Taiwan components and manufacturing that risk, but also the Chinese supply chain. There could be economic sanctions or like trade barriers that come out. So I think what you started to mention now is the impact on Southeast Asia. And I think there's a quite diverse group of countries. Obviously, there's Vietnam, there's Indonesia, there's Singapore. So lots of different impacts, Philippines, Thailand, Malaysia as well. So I guess in my head, I think one question that I'll have is Vietnam is like the third largest trade deficit for America in terms of nations. I think a lot of people are saying, like, is there a risk that it would also come under the same trade barriers or tariffs? I think it's one side. Or is it going to be like, this is a way for us to move manufacturing out of China anyway? So just curious.
It's both, because if you see the crackdown on China, the natural response will be to reroute certain trade goods through Vietnam that were actually manufactured in China or through Singapore, as the case may be. And when the Trump administration sees this happening, they will then have to reconsider their policies with regards to these countries if these countries are not policing it effectively. So there's that dynamic, and there's also the other dynamic where the Trump administration sees the trade deficit they have with these countries, and they're going to want to impose tariffs to try to correct that as well. I know Vietnam is trying to figure out how they can reduce their tariff, if they can buy more agricultural goods or buy more LNG, just to do something to reduce the large amount of deficit. In a triangular system with multiple other countries, Vietnam is still importing things that the US is producing, but if they can import directly from the US, it would look a lot better optically from the Trump administration.
Yeah, I think they also made a big push to buy a lot of planes, I think, from Boeing as well. So I think there's a lot of moves where I think the Vietnamese situation is pushing hard on that side as well. I think on the Singapore side, it's also be interesting because Singapore is trying to stay neutral right now between all parties. And I think I was just talking to somebody last night, and the conversation was like, do you think that's possible for Singapore to stay neutral? I think that's an open question.
Once there's a much stronger controls on China, if they do make a move on Taiwan, it would be extremely difficult to stay actually neutral, because being neutral would by definition being on the side of China in a sense, if they continue to try to facilitate interactions between China and the rest of the world. So that will be a challenge that they'll have to address when it comes down to it, is how do they stay neutral while not necessarily facilitating transactions that the US and others might want to ban.
Yeah, I think everybody's just hoping that the status quo continues, and then sure, it's okay for supply chain to change and everything, but everybody's hoping that the shoe doesn't drop.
Yeah, Xi Jinping did just say recently that they didn't have to take over Taiwan in 2027. So people are hoping that means that he's going to take a more conciliatory approach. But at the same time, I think the Taiwanese president has been making more statements that is almost baiting them into doing something.
I think that's the tricky part for why the one China policy has existed, right? Is that it's supposed to keep it diffuse enough and hopefully defuse the situation as much as possible. And I think everybody's worried that it's going to get peeled away or actions taken in the next decade.
Obviously, in retrospect, though, the one China policy agreements were an obvious mistake that was made at a time when it was actually a mistake for the West. It was a brilliant move by China to postpone this while they regrew their economy and had more bargaining power and more physical power later on. But to not settle the question when they were not dominant in various ways was obviously, yes, give them 50 years to grow into the power and use the population to against them. I guess the people at the time were far more worried about Russia and the Soviet Union than about China. So it's understandable.
I mean, yeah, it's hard to rewrite history in 1950, 1960, 1970. But I think it's going to be interesting because I think Southeast Asia is like in this interesting spot, which is like, is the current situation net positive, net negative? I think people are really that question mark zone right now.
The China plus one demand has been an obvious net positive as many corporations have increased their FDI in the countries in the region as they needed to move out of China. And there's also some potential skill transfer and other things as they're upgrading the capabilities of these factories to produce the higher value goods. So that's parts of net positive. The trade war aspect could end up being a net negative if it escalates to a trade war.
Yeah, I think that's the tricky part. As of today, it's net positive because of China plus one. But if it rolls up into a real trade war where trade volumes drop, then I think it might be net neutral, net negative.
And in general, like when economies do well, I think people miss this. It is positive sum. When the economies are functioning better, everyone is better off. And when things are not functioning better, everyone is worse off. If China moves against Taiwan, that's catastrophic, obviously, mostly for Taiwan, but also the rest of the world. So similarly, if there's a massive trade war, that can end up being very bad for the rest of the world as well. Although the cost advantage is such that if tariffs do go up 20%, there is still going to be goods shipped from Vietnam, from Indonesia, et cetera, to the US. That's not going to make the US producers that are making them at 2x. It's going to reduce the demand for these products from these factories, but it's not going to mean they're not the ones still making them and selling them into the US. They'll just be slightly less profitable and grow a bit more slowly.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting because that rebalancing of Southeast Asia tigers, right? They were historically export oriented and they exported to the US, right? It used to be CD players and now it's AirPods and iPhones. So I think to some extent, tariffs being a consumption tax on the American consumer does in the long term actually feels like it's a slowing of demand for Asian exports. So it's interesting, a short term, medium term, long term kind of dynamic.
As long as the tariffs aren't rising just with no expectation of stopping it, it is one hit to the demand, and then the demand will go back to grow and hopefully catch that baseline in a few years or so as well, depending on the area. So it's not like tariffs will mean that these countries will not be exporting. I think also the export growth will still be extremely important for them, and investors, I think in Indonesia especially, are still going to be looking for export-oriented companies so they can make sure that the customers are real and that there's real demand for the products.
Yeah, I think I like what you said about it. It's like the assumption that we have is that these tariffs are also one time, and obviously the current Trump administration is for 4 years, and then after that there'll be another election. But I think it's interesting because one thing that we were discussing across some Southeast Asian friends is that even if there is a Democrat administration, it may not necessarily mean that the tariffs go down actually. So similar to how Biden actually continued many Trump policies as well. So I think it's not just one time. It's not going to go to zero. It's not temporal or temporary. But like I said, it could go up again. It could continue with no change, or it could be repealed. And I think that's the part where a lot of folks are like, is this policy for 3 years? How do you adjust for that?
Yeah, Biden did continue the tariffs, and J.D. Vance is likely to continue. If he is the nominee next time around, he was likely to continue a variety of the policies of the Trump administration. And if he's elected, it'll be because they're popular. So it's one of those things where the tariffs will continue, but the cost advantage of Southeast Asia is going to be greater than most of these tariffs. It would be hard to use tariffs alone to keep BYD out of America. They have to basically ban the cars from operating or ban certain aspects of the cars and the way they report data back to China or whatnot to stop them from operating in the US. As long as products are not outright banned from Southeast Asia, they'll still be relatively competitive in selling into the US market. It might be a US market that's smaller or is growing more slowly than it was previously, but they'll still be the main suppliers of the goods that they have the comparative advantage in producing.
Yeah, I think it's going to be an interesting time for the next few years. I'm just curious, is there any advice that you give to Southeast Asian friends? Is there anything that you would advise them to think about or consider?
I would just advise them not to panic as much about this as they seem to be panicking. and also to realize that there is far more of a method to what's coming out of the US than people think. The Europeans are now scrambling to do exactly what the US has been trying to get them to do for the last 10, 15 years, which is actually spend more of their money on defense and take care of themselves. And they're doing it because they're angry at Trump, but they're actually doing it now. And so people say, oh, it was a mess up, look how he angered all those people. It's like, but he got exactly what, not just what Trump wants, but what the US has always been trying to accomplish.
Yeah, I think it's fair that everybody knows that Europe had below average defense spending as a percentage of GDP, and they were using that as a budget for education or social services, etc. This is something that is a set of negotiation for both parties.
Yeah, judging the US as being out of control when it's not actually out of control and there are reasons behind what they're doing is one of the main things. And also just not panicking as much about it. Obviously, it's very bad for certain businesses if they get hit by tariffs and they'll have to change the prices and demand will go down. For the businesses on the cusp of being non-viable, this might send a few over the edge, but for the other businesses that were actually viable and profitable already, it's going to be a hit, but it's not going to be that big of a hit.
Do you see more Chinese businesses moving out into Southeast Asia?
And obviously, the biggest example is ByteDance trying to pretend they're a Singaporean company, right? To the extent that they're global businesses, there might be a few more trying that. But there's also been some pushback when, I'm trying to remember, it was Li Keqiang, he sold the ports in Panama. Right? Now China's implementing an antitrust investigation of that move. So there are Chinese companies who are going to be constrained by the Chinese government in how they operate outside of China, and the ones who have the blessing to move outside will, but it's unlikely that Xi Jinping wants many of these Chinese companies to actually relocate from China. But for the ones who are small enough where they escape that attention, they're able to reposition themselves as a Southeast Asian company or even a US company. If they can get out of China, they will have advantages to be doing that.
Yeah. Actually, I was quite surprised that the Li Keqiang sold their ports globally as well as the facilities around the Panama Canal. Because generally, I feel like just that kind of move would have to be cleared by the Chinese government first.
So Hong Kong, publicly listed Hong Kong company. And when the government is mad at you in a small country like that, they can make it extremely unprofitable for you to disobey them. And so Panama's arm was being twisted by the US, and the US is extremely able to twist arms with the companies in their jurisdiction.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of behind the scenes interactions with the US government, with the Chinese government. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. I just feel like this is going to be a giant legal and political free-for-all for another 1 year at least.
Yeah, they were in a no-win situation, and getting some liquidity from that was probably the right move.
From a company perspective, because you're just saying this is the time for me to sell before it gets hot. But whether they're going to be allowed to do it.
They can't really reverse it at this point now, can they? Because it's outside of China's jurisdiction.
Yeah, but let's see. I feel like I've stopped trying to be I tend to be sometimes surprised by what can happen actually.
I'm not going to say they're not going to be punished inside China, but they are trying to say at the same time, look, Jack Ma's back, please build technology more in China, because they realize the extent of their mistake. So it was interesting how both countries were actually very anti-capitalist in some ways over the immediate pre-COVID, post-COVID years, with China cracking down on technology in various ways, and the US having administration that was further to the left than they've had in recent history. And both of them corrected, but in different ways. In China, it was just Xi Jinping changing his mind. In the US, it was an election that brought Trump into power.
Yeah, I think it's going to be interesting because nobody knows what Xi Jinping is thinking. So I think that's the tricky part quite much. I don't know, reading the tea leaves a little bit. So what exactly are the moves that's going to happen?
Yep, and it's hard to, when someone has absolute power, it's very hard to predict what they're going to do. No one expected Putin to really want to engage in a long-term, full-scale war that drained his country's military resources significantly in trying to capture Ukraine. There was obviously people who saw it coming when it was getting closer, but as just a strategic move that just seems like inexplicable back in 2018.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the calculus back then was they thought it was going to be easy, right? And now it's turned out to be a lot harder. So I think that's the tricky part, is the facts change over time. And I think when we look at the future, when you think about the next 5 years, 2030, what's your hope for, what's your prediction for Southeast Asia? What do you think is going to be that world from your perspective?
Southeast Asia is still one of the fastest growing areas in the world, and I hope that different economies see where they've been messing up a little bit and preventing some of that growth. Because keep in mind, for countries at the level of Vietnam and Indonesia, if they had really strong policies, they would be growing at 10, 12%, which is the rate that China had when they were about as rich as those countries. So if Vietnam has some power constraints that they need to solve to unleash their growth, and among some other issues that their economy is facing, Indonesia similarly has various regulatory issues they need to figure out and smooth out for external investors. I think I've heard that there's a variety of large financial companies, global companies that refuse to sign any deals in Indonesia, and they have to sign them in Singapore because they don't trust the Indonesian courts not to automatically side with the local powerful families. As long as those dynamics persist and outsiders are deemed to be the suckers who fund projects for the insiders that eventually walk away with that money, it's going to be very difficult for these economies to actually hit those levels of growth that can allow them to prosper at a much increased rate compared to today.
I think there's so much more growth possible in Vietnam, Indonesia, and the rest of Southeast Asia. It's just that the right government policies and right government actions can really turbocharge that. And I think recently we saw the scandals for e-fishery and some other fraud in the tech Southeast Asian landscape that has disrupted investor confidence for sure.
Yeah, it would be nice to see some tech champions emerge inside these economies where they're actually tech champions that dominate the economy, not because they're able to raise the most money, but because they're able to be extremely profitable.
Exactly, and I think that's going to be the path moving forward for the tech sector in Southeast Asia. On that note, love to wrap things up. Thank you so much for coming and sharing your story.
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy. Was this a story?
The story of what Southeast Asia could be over the next 5 years. That's the narrative, and we have to check back in 5 years.
Yeah.
Hopefully, in the next 5 years, we'll be like, oh, that was spot on.
I guess this was a story of sorts.
I think that's not really. We don't know what the next chapter looks like.
Yeah.
So on that note, see you next time.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy.
Thank you for listening to Brave. If you enjoyed this episode, please share the podcast with your friends and colleagues. We would also appreciate you leaving a rating or review. Head over to www.bravesea.com for member content, resources, and community. Stay well and stay brave.